start with you, Dave.
Buonanno ragazzi, welcome to another year of Serie A football, another year on the Serie A Chronicles podcast. It's Nikki Bandini welcoming you into 2024, and I have with me for the new year our recently upgraded crew of myself, Mina Azuki, and Patrick Kendrick. Guys, did you have amazing Christmases and New Years?
Amazing is a stretch. I don't know about you guys, but it was nice. There was at one point on New Year's Eve where it was raining so heavily, I started to contemplate suicide. That might be too much, but sometimes the weather is just sorry, but it's just I'm starting to get that seasonal whatever disorder that you get.
Disorder, sad.
Yes, sad, and I'm sad because of sad. It is. It's perfect. And I'm watching it. There was a New Year game, which I don't even remember now because I'm starting to lose my memory because this is what happens with old age as well. And I just started to think, like, how could it be raining this much? Yeah, I think it was the Spurs game. No, it wasn't. It was Fulham. Oh, Nikki, that was a hideous game on behalf of your boys.
Gosh.
But anyway. Yeah. So
I had to talk about it afterwards as well.
And I was just like,
what was the other one? What was the other one?
No. I'm sorry, Nikki. It's just one hideous performance after another by Mikel Arteta. But anyway, and so then I was like, yeah, it's been a really nice Merry Christmas because all the family is around. But then New Year's weather kind of ruined it a bit. And then, it's the usual disappointment when it comes to December 31st. But that's all about me. What about you, Patrick?
Well, it's interesting when you said,
have a bone to pick with Patrick. I need to cut Patrick off because we need to talk about something.
Let's hear it.
Something very important, which is that Patrick, who was actually just telling us before the show that he had a couple of not such good episodes of luck going back home to England for Christmas. So he went to Naples for Christmas this year. Great choice. He was treating himself at Christmas to some pizza fritta. Again, great choice. But for some reason, he chose to come at tortellini and brodo. For some reason, he thought that he couldn't just enjoy his pizza fritta. He had to come at the best Christmas food, but it's not Christmas food. Have your tortellini and brodo all year round. Have it in the summer, have it in the spring. I don't care, because when you're a true child of Emilia-Romagna, of Bologna, like myself, then you absolutely are having that stuff all year and you're loving it all year.
I think it's sort of like the Ronaldo-Messi debate, although it pains me to try and put, tortellini and brodo in that category, but you're not content simply to say Cristiano Ronaldo is the best player of his generation. You then have to denigrate the other one as well to sort of justify your point. So for me, it was like pizza fritta. I mean, it's nailed on as the best Italian, food on Christmas Eve. But as soon as someone came back at me with a rival, then I feel you have to sort of step in and also slate them. So that's why I don't think tortellini and brodo would have necessarily felt my wrath had it not been for people levelling at me as a possible. Oh no, actually, to be fair, I think we would. Actually, I was the one that led with that offensive, to be honest, wasn't I? I said, I think you can keep your tortellini and brodo and make mine a pizza fritta. So I think I must have been discussing it with Northerners in the build-up to Christmas, and I was gloating at the fact I was heading south, and that's what I was going to be eating. So I think it was premeditated. So yeah, I hold my hands up, and there you have it. But yeah, the pizza fritta was delicious. And there you see, Mina's just backed me up, so that's 2 against 1, and I think that's a landslide, isn't it? 66%.
Well, this is outrageous. I would like to be backed up by our listeners. Listeners, hopefully you've had the pleasure in your life to go to Bologna or nearby places and to enjoy proper pasta, and you can all tell Patrick how wrong he is. But in the meantime, we should probably start talking about the football. Juventus Roma, Patrick, this was part of your festive feast, was doing commentary on this game. It was a fascinating setup, I suppose, between the two teams who we know love to win a cortomuso. That might be Max Allegri's phrase, but we certainly know Jose is not afraid of going for those 1-0 results or even 0-0 results some of the time against the big clubs. It was a cagey game. It felt to me like perhaps Roma felt like they were getting the better at the start of the game. But somehow it also felt to me like, yeah, but you knew that in the end, it's Max Allegri and his Juventus team know how to do this better.
Yeah, it felt a little bit inevitable that would be the result as and when Rabiot got the breakthrough. And the biggest thing for Juventus was, I've spoken about it on previous episodes of the pod, scoring early is huge for this team because they actually relish defending a lot more than they actually seem to enjoy pursuing goals in the first place. So I think as and when they've got their goal, particularly against sides which can become quite predictable, and I put Roma into the same bracket as I did Fiorentina when they lost at the Franchi earlier on this season. When you don't seem to have a plan B and you're just getting to the edge of Juventus' box and playing slow sideways passes, it's turgid possession, or you're tossing the ball into the box where Danilo, Bremer and Gatti just thrive on heading the ball clear, then I think you're playing right into Juventus' hands. So to me, it was always a case of if Juventus score, then they will go on and win the game. And that goal came relatively early in the second half. And besides a shot from Brian Cristante, which took a deflection off Vlahovic very early on and caught the outside of the post, Roma never really looked like scoring. Actually, Cristante spoke to Lega Serie A after the game, and he said, I think we produced an excellent performance. I think, the game came down to fine margins. And it just felt like platitudes being trotted out. My response to that is, what game were you watching? Juventus, for the umpteenth time this season, never really looked under threat. They never really looked like conceding. And I'm actually beginning to revise my opinion of them. Before, I was very much in the camp of, this is not sustainable. Winning by one goal is not necessarily conducive to a title challenge. But what I now think is, actually, they defend so well that provided they don't give away easy goals like they did at Frosinone and Genoa, and Allegri was hammering them about that, then I actually think this is quite a good approach for this team, who are relatively limited in terms of the way they play football, but they do have star quality to get goals. And there was a nice cameo for an hour from Kenan Yildiz as well, who really pushed on from what we'd seen at Frosinone. So I think there's enough in this team that makes me think that they can actually go on and push Inter. And I think Inter are getting a little bit frightened. And I think Inter are also very frustrated by the fact that they feel that when they win, they batter teams, and they love hearing this praise. And I think they're congratulating themselves on being the best footballing side and producing the most aesthetically pleasing football. And I think it actually rankles with them and really riles them, the fact that this Juventus side that are quite ordinary are only 2 points behind. But again, Inter have only themselves to blame for that because they couldn't get over the line at Genoa. But I'm thoroughly impressed with what Allegri's doing. I'm thoroughly impressed with what this Juventus team is doing. I think they are really impressive in terms of the sum of their parts. If you look at those individual players, it's not a vintage side by any means, but this was built up to be the whole risultatista. It was the battle of Allegri against Mourinho. The ends justify the means, and the only thing that matters is getting a result. And in the end, Allegri showed that he's still capable of doing that in 2023. Now it's 2024. And I think it seems to have passed Mourinho by, his ability to get results in one-off games in big matches.
What he said, basically. This is a really interesting thing, because when you look at sort of like the statistics last year, because they kept a lot of clean sheets at one point as well, Juventus, and then if you look at the statistics, it looked like they were really lucky that they were getting away with so much defensively, and that there was going to be a point where they would have to go back to the mean, basically, and realize that they are performing above expectations because of the way that they were defending was not good enough, frankly speaking. Nowadays, when you look at their XG and the way that they're playing and how they are defending, what they're allowing is shots from outside of the box because they think they can pretty much manage that, and everything inside has become so difficult because, of course, they have that mix of physicality and just downright determination at the back. And when you look at the way that they were defending, it was such compact, tight lines, so perfectly clear, like seamless, in the sense 5 at the back, 3 packed in the middle, and everyone was doing their part. And I think that when you look at the way that they're defending now, no, they are not performing above expectations. They are performing to expectations. And I don't see them actually in any way, shape or form falling apart. What worries me as well is that when you watched Inter against Genoa, was the performances of some of their players that have always been so important to them, whether that's Thuram, and we can talk about that later, but it's also how gassed they look. Like, I mean, Çalhanoğlu looks exhausted. And I think that's something that they are playing more games. I don't know if that's going to be something that will eventually give Allegri the upper hand, or we don't know, because there's obviously the Coppa Italia to come up for Juventus, and that they're going to play, and we'll see what we do. But it's the 20th clean sheet for Juventus in 2023. It's their 12th 1-0 success of the year in 2023. I think that when you have Lukaku, for some reason, when it comes to Lukaku and Juve's defense, whoever's playing at the back, there's a problem there. He seems to always, they know how to shut him out, and they managed to do that. And they couldn't really trigger Dybala in the way that they wanted to either. And I think it's worth mentioning that Rabiot is, it's bizarre with Rabiot, because I don't know what to think of him. I used to think he was the worst midfielder in the world, and now I'm like, wow, that's pretty good. Like, he's been brilliant this year,
Yeah.
So not brilliant at all times. I mean, you and I spoke about this, Nikki, when I was praying that someone would come and purchase him, when we were doing our show together on Sky. And I was just looking at him and thinking, this is not to the level. And I firmly believe in a great midfield wins you matches. And I look at this midfield and I'm quite amazed really at how McKennie's performing, because this was a guy that was relegated last season in the Premier League. This was a guy that they were trying to sell deeply. And he's not a brilliant footballer, but I thought that he's always available. He's always looking for a way to just, get back the ball and move it forward. I think there's just so many different performances in that midfield that for me is so subpar and not ever of the quality that I would expect from Juventus. And yet here's the side that's managing to just use its will and its mentality to get further. And the fact is that all Allegri could talk about in his post-match conference is the fact that there's another kid that he wants to introduce called Nonge, that he hasn't had an opportunity to launch yet. And I think that tells you everything that you need to know. This isn't a team built on investing well in the market, because the players that, like Pogba, that they did try to bring, or Vlahovic, haven't necessarily, well, Pogba hasn't been available, and Vlahovic is in and out of the team. This was a great performance from him. This is a team that's really looking to their squad, to their youth, to make a difference, and they are making a difference. And that is what I think that Allegri constantly gets hassled about. Oh, you don't know how to develop players. Oh, you don't introduce youth. I don't know. I think he knows how to do both of them, and I think that the proof is in the pudding. We just need to see the performances this year. And Yildiz looks like a superstar in the making. I don't even think Juve can keep this guy anymore.
It's a quick response from Mina already straight away after a flash giving up the ghost on keeping hold of a player. Perhaps that relates to all the economic woes that's going to come with the growth decree, which we will also talk about in a little bit. I thought to talk about the sort of tactical part of things, and you mentioned tight lines there, Mina. Actually, I thought one of the things that was interesting in this game is the two teams mirrored each other in theory. You had two teams notionally playing in the same formation, which is 3-5-2, but they didn't really look that much like each other. And actually, to me, that's because Juventus' midfield was much more fluid than Roma's. Juventus' midfield had runners. Juventus' midfield had Rabiot, had McKennie willing to get up and down and connecting with the forwards, and the forwards willing to drop back and take space. That Roma midfield three, they're solid. Paredes, Bove, Cristante, but there was no action from it. There was no up and down. And when Cristante was talking about, oh, this game could have gone either way, look, he hit the woodwork at the beginning of the game. But after that, I'm completely in agreement with Patrick, because it felt like the idea was hold your lines, and it almost felt like that extended the attack. You've just got get the ball to Lukaku and Dybala and hope they do something, which I can see why that would be the formula, because frankly, that formula has worked plenty for Roma this season, but it's not a good enough formula for top level football, for elite level football, I think, in 2023. 2024, I should say now. It was still last year when this game happened. And I think that for all the criticism of Allegri's football, some of it, which I think is still justified, I'm not willing to go all the way to this team is suddenly now in this perfect mode just because it wins every game 1-0. But there is a much more natural fluidity and therefore unpredictability, I think, to this Juventus team than there is to Roma, even though they are still a cautious team perhaps. And I think that's how you get openings like Rabiot running through for that goal even if it has meant perhaps that you haven't had quite as productive seasons from the centre forwards as Roma's have, where there's so much focus on getting the ball to them. Let's talk some more about Yildiz. Do you want to come back on that? Sorry, Mina.
No, continue. Sorry, I was just going to say I was going to come in after you.
I know. I was just going to ask Patrick for his opinion on Yildiz, but if you had something you want to come back to me on, then do.
I think that mostly what I wanted to say in that is that I agree with you. I think what Juventus have is youth. And there was a lot of talk in the summer about how best to use that. And in the beginning, it was a case of let's try to press and harry every opponent in front of us. And that's how they played. You remember in their first few matches, you could see that there was a different way of approaching this. It seems like Allegri then just said, like, let's revert to type. Let's make sure that we have a good defense. But it was clear that what he wanted to do in the first half was to leave the ball to Roma and see what they could do. And, play sort of you take the ball, let's see what you can do. We can get a goal and then just defend. And most importantly, we can introduce Chiesa afterwards. And then Chiesa is a great counter-attacking player as well. And that gives us another hand that if we hadn't scored a goal, then perhaps he can do something by launching something going forward. And it's clear that there's obviously a rotation up front. There isn't really, other than players like Rabiot, for example, and Bremer at the back, that up front it keeps changing, and we keep seeing different plans, whether it's Yildiz up front, was it Ken, obviously Vlahovic and Chiesa, and there just seems to be this way of trying to use it as much as possible. There isn't a clear plan. There isn't a clear team right now for Juventus, because the midfield is all over the place and the attack is all over the place. Yet everyone understands what they're going to do off the ball, and everyone seems to know what to do on the ball, and I think that's what's impressive. But I don't also think that it's a very beautiful team going forward. I just think it's a very pragmatic and intelligent team. And that is how you sort of know an Allegri side. Like, it's not one that I watch and think, oh, this is champagne football. Like I did a show with BBC just before the game, and I said to them, this is a 1-0 victory for Juventus. It's so clear, because this is just what they do. And they're going to know how to do it against a side that doesn't have as much creativity up front.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I wasn't sure if Patrick was going to come back on that one. I essentially agree, and I think that's kind of the point that I was getting at, and I think what seems like all of us thought of it with this Juventus team in this sort of matchup against Roma is there's just more to Juventus than there is to Roma. There's more ideas than there is, even though they might on the surface sometimes look the same. And I suppose then I do want to turn to the opposite side of that coin, which is this not just more grist for the mill of Mourinho is a busted flush? I thought the lack of ideas this Roma team had was really sharp contrast, because they had more of the ball. They had a lot more of the ball. They're not the first team to get it against Juventus, but they didn't really have any great plan for what they were going to do with it.
No plan whatsoever, I think. In the first half, until he tired and came off after an hour, their plan was play the ball to Paulo Dybala, who dropped into the right-hand channel, and ask him to try and do something by bending a ball into the back post and either getting a runner in, and none of the runners ever timed their run correctly, be it Bove or Zalewski, a couple of the kids from the academy, or Lukaku is just absolutely mean as spot on. He has been so ineffectual against Juventus, and it's nothing new. And Bremer seems to thrive against him, and that's not unique to Juventus, by the way. That was my co-commentator for the game, Manuel Pascali, who used to be Kilmarnock captain and centre-back himself. He said exactly the same. He said he remembered every time Inter would play against Torino when Bremer was there, Lukaku would just be completely anonymous, and Bremer nullified him again, and he seems to relish coming up against him. And Bremer, by the way, just take the opportunity, I know this is a point about Roma, but Bremer's second season at Juventus has been absolutely outstanding. That's why he's earned the contract extension. But coming back to Roma, it was very predictable, and Allegri loves predictability, especially when it comes to how to defend. They never got in behind Juventus, who admittedly sat deep, allowed Roma to have the ball. The second half, when the last 20 minutes or so, Juventus put just 2 banks of 5 there and said, break us down. Here's the ball. And no one did. Dybala had gone off the pitch by then, and there was just absolutely nothing. They never looked like scoring. The closest they came was a header from Azmoun, which was a really low percentage. Even then, he did well to generate the power he did on it. And Pellegrini came on and he'd been an impact sub against Napoli, didn't really offer a great deal. I just don't think this Roma side knows exactly what they should be doing. I don't think this Roma side believes a great deal in what their coach is coming up with. I think it's still too much of a reliance on we're going to have a goal-scoring Lukaku and we're going to have a creative force in Dybala, and between them, they will win us more matches than we'll lose, which is a fine approach when you're playing against 13 or 14 of the teams in Serie A. But we've consistently seen for Roma, Napoli win notwithstanding, that when they come up against the bigger sides, they just don't seem to have a way of breaking them down. They didn't score against Inter. They didn't score against Lazio in the derby. There's just been countless occasions when they just don't ever really look like producing a great deal. Even then, a lot of their numbers have been bolstered elsewhere. You think that their goals for tally is helped by them scoring 7 against Empoli. If you take that 7 off, then you look at their numbers. It's just not great, to be honest. And I don't really know, beyond them playing a through ball to Lukaku or Dybala shooting from outside the box or beating a couple of players, I don't really know what Roma's plan is. I don't watch them and get excited. I don't ever think this is going to be because all of the build-up to this game was Roma won impressively against Napoli. Have they taken the next step? Is this team finally ready to show that they can not only beat the teams they're expected to beat, but also thrive in these 6-pointers and beat their rivals, something they haven't done under previous management. They didn't do it under Paulo Fonseca. Mourinho was brought in to do that. And he just hasn't been able to do that, despite huge investment, despite lots being spent on wage bills. I know people will say they haven't spent a lot in terms of the way they've structured the various deals, but at no stage do I get excited about this team whatsoever. And I think if you can't get excited about them when they're playing against Juventus, which has historically been quite a nice, tasty rivalry for the last 20 years in Serie A, beyond that as well, and the fact that they're on the back of just beating Napoli, then I don't know when you're going to get excited about them, to be honest. And I don't really know how this changes. It all feels very stale.
I think, unfortunately, it has to be said, after another disappointing result for Napoli at home against Monza this weekend, are we even really still looking at results against Napoli and thinking of them as particularly landmark results in a season for some teams? I mean, Napoli are the champions of Italy, but they're also currently 8th in the table for a reason. They've dropped a lot of games. They have. It's just the reality. But I think unless Mina had something else burning to say on that game, it might be time to get on to the team who are still leading this year's title race, Inter, and then we can talk about the race between them and Juventus, because Inter did drop points this weekend against Genoa. Went 1-0 up with Genoa before Dragushin scored the equaliser. And because this is January, we got an almost instantaneous report linking Dragushin with Tottenham Hotspur. I thought that's amazing how quickly these things happen in the January transfer window. I don't actually know if those two things are related, but I did think it was very sort of, without being too sweeping with my brush, very Premier League timing, that a player scores an important goal against a big team in another league and then immediately, look, he's being linked to a Premier League club. But Mina, I know you had your eye on this game and perhaps weren't so impressed with the league leaders, sorry.
Just a point on Dragushin, just because I do follow him, because I'm very disappointed that he's not playing for Juventus. They have been tracking him for a while now, to be honest with you. I think that people just love seeing him score a big goal and then further exacerbating all the rumours. But Tottenham have had their eye on him for a while because Paratici knows him so well and he's working as a consultant right now because he doesn't have a full-time job because of obviously what happened. When it came to Inter and Genoa, to be honest with you, it's not that I wasn't impressed. I saw this coming. They have a beautiful team and they have a lot of squad depth, but they don't have depth up front. And Arnautovic actually was very good, but this team without Lautaro Martinez is not the same. And I also think it's a team that has struggled against sides that press them incessantly and can be very suffocating and want to take them on. And we saw that now with Genoa, and we saw that against Real Sociedad, who are exactly the same. Sociedad's obviously better at it. They're just a side that just exhausts you in every way, and then you can't think. Your timings then are thrown, and Inter don't regularly face teams like that in Serie A. But Genoa has this ability to. I mean, it's a team that can't beat Empoli, but for some reason can manage to draw Juventus and Inter. I mean, go figure. But it is about trying to stop Inter from really thinking and being able to wield their opportunities. There was all this controversy with surrounding Arnautovic's goal and whether or not Bisek's push on, was it Strootman? Who was it that he, anyway,
Yes.
It was Strootman. You know, how much that affected it. But honestly speaking, they are without Di Marco. They are without Lautaro Martinez. I don't expect them to win every match. So I understand that sometimes it can get a lot. It's the end of the year. It can happen. What I think is funny is how much Juventus and Inter seem to mirror each other's results. I mean, pretty much the only difference is Atalanta right now. That's why the 2 points are there, because Atalanta managed to get a 0-0 draw against Juventus, and obviously Inter thrashed them. So, but otherwise, I think this is a game in which I guess it's more important. You see, you're seeing people like Gilardino and what Thiago Motta are doing is what highlights for me, for example, what perhaps Mourinho is not doing, or even Allegri. I mean, at least Allegri has formed this identity and he's got a team that's got such mental strength. But for example, Thiago Motta's Bologna were losing, and you could see that I think he tried 3 different things to change to try to make sure that somehow they could get back on level terms. I mean, it didn't work, so he doesn't have the players for it. But you could see the different tactical changes that he was trying to do in order to win that match. You see Gilardino and how he's managed to get them into one-on-one duels and how to get Inter engaged and like having to win these duels rather than play their game. And I think that when you see those performances by these coaches and how they're training their teams, it makes you realize perhaps the likes of Jose Mourinho are not doing enough and are relying a lot more on just having better, technically capable players, where there isn't really a pattern of play up front. You're just depending on the fact that you think Lukaku's a better striker than most, that Dybala is more creative than most, and so on and so forth. But having said that, I also, you know, just going back to the Roma point, I also feel sorry a little bit for him because he is dealing with a team that isn't fully capable because they're all absent all the time. But on this front, it can happen with Inter, so I don't want to be mean about them because, you know, Sommer makes a mistake. It can happen.
Yeah, I think with Inter, like I think both of these things can be true. I think it's absurd to expect any team to win every game. They're not going to. And so that sort of bar of expectation that because we've been saying Inter are the best team, which I think I still believe is an unrealistic one. And I think there are positives even within this game. Yes, some controversy around the goal, but the fact that in the end Arnautovic has that goal and it's another sort of confidence building moment for him is good for them. Not just Inter are expected to win every game. Inter can't keep a clean sheet every game, and they've kept a lot, right? They're going to concede goals sometimes. So I think those things all individually are true. Having said that, it's the whole thing, isn't it, Patrick, that we've been talking about before. When you've got Juventus behind you, it's like this sort of ominous horror movie villain that won't stop tracking you, right? If you're Inter and you know Juventus are there and you know they keep grinding out results, you know that every time you look over your shoulder, they're still going to be following you. They're not sprinting. They don't have to sprint. They're just going to keep following you. And you're the one who has to not put a foot wrong. That's a big pressure to live with for a whole season.
Huge pressure. And obviously you can't pick and choose how many goals you score in each game, but it will be frustrating to know that Inter scored 4 against Udinese and kept a clean sheet and then could only score 1 at Genoa. You know, it's things like that will rile you, and because there's just no real sort of rhyme or reason to it. And Genoa are very strong at Marassi. This is a team that beat Roma 4-1 at home. This is a team that led 2-0 against Napoli before Raspadori and Politano scored in the second half to make it 2 each. They've drawn against Juventus at home. They've drawn against Inter at home. So this is no flash in the pan or fluke. They're very strong at home. Marassi's an awkward place to go. The atmosphere is electric. They call it the most English stadium in Italy because the hoardings and the fans are very close to you. That said, it was very interesting to see a team that's able to score from a corner against Inter, who are ordinarily doing that to the opposition. So I think certain flaws were exposed in Simone Inzaghi's team this past weekend. And I think they'll still be top at the halfway stage. There will be winter champions, so make of that what you will. And it's becoming less and less relevant in recent years. 4 of the last 8 teams that have been top at halfway haven't gone on to win the league, whereas ordinarily, they would, historically, statistically, they would be crowned champions. So I think we are seeing some flaws in Inter. I stand by what I said, and I agree with you that I think over the long haul they play the best football, they create the most chances. You add to that the fact they still have the best defence in the division. I think that will probably mean that they should actually increase this gap over Juventus as opposed to it diminishing. But we've seen it move from 4 back down to 2, and there will be a danger for Inter that Juventus playing once a week will just be able to stay in touch with them, and then who knows if we come to that second meeting between them at San Siro, and I don't have the date offhand when that game is, and Juventus are right there, then suddenly that's the sort of situation where you could see Allegri's team thriving because he's won 6 league titles, 5 of which came with Juventus, and Simone Inzaghi is still being called the sort of nearly man when it comes to winning the domestic title. So I think there's something in it. Psychologically, it's huge having Juventus right there. And I think Inter players and senior management figures are getting still too caught up in Juventus have a big wage bill. Look how much they've spent. They're only playing 1 game a week. They're not in Europe. They should be favourites. And I think they're focusing too much on their opponents and not enough on themselves. I think it needs to be a case of, yes, we're strong. We're going to win our games. We're going to win the title. And I think they've got a little bit sucked into the Juventus mind games recently, which is great. I mean, as a neutral, it's what we want to see. We want a close title race. Well, it was fantastic seeing Napoli win the league by 30 after 33 years by 17 points last season, nearly winning it come the end of April. But it's much better when we have a tight title race like we did when Milan won it from 2 points ahead of Inter. And there could be something very similar this season, the way things are going.
Just a question, because this gets talked about a lot when it comes to salaries, and obviously it was printed as well in the start of the season how much the wage bills are for Roma, Milan, Juve, Inter, and Juventus was above Inter by a very marginal amount. It was 2,000. I want to ask, was that it would have been including Pogba's salary, right? Which is the difference maker, but Juventus, because it's 10 million. So now that he's not there, well, I mean, he is there, but he's being paid 45,000.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so considering everything that's happened to him, and he's now on this nominal fee of 45,000 that they have to pay him, does that not mean the wages have gone down overall for Inter, and actually Inter are now, like for Juventus, and that Inter are now more? Just a question.
I mean, would
that not be put into the balance sheet already? Would that not be budgeted for at the start of the season? Because
at the start when it was printed, Pogba was playing the first matches. So
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, so they would have budgeted for his salary. So I don't know if then you then amend what the balance sheet would read at the start of the financial year. I don't really know how that works.
You're right. Ignore the balance sheet a second. If you're talking about just what like Gazzetta puts up, or like Repubblica, which is the wages of every single team, and that's how this is what people refer to. If you look at it, like it's 100 and something, and I remember there's a 2,000 difference or so maybe between the two. And this is how much they pay over the year. So if you take away Pogba's salary, then it's lower, right? It's a weird pedantic thing to talk about, but I'm just like, because they're still paying Fagioli, so his would still be considered like when you consider it over the year. But I'm not talking about balance sheets, just really roughly what the articles write about how much Juventus pay in general per year in salaries, and how much Inter pay, and then it's not really that much of a difference. So
yeah, I feel like it's a reductive conversation anyway to put football down
money
to who pays the most. But what I would say is, what I find concerning when I hear that Acerbi interview, and you need to hear the whole interview, certain quotes were taken out of context, but Acerbi basically started, when someone said, do you feel your favourites to win the league? He said, yes, but let's, hang on a moment. Juventus have got an expensively assembled squad. There are other teams that have spent a lot of money. Juventus aren't in Europe, etc. I did feel there was too much of that focusing on what other people were doing. And it felt like the sort of arguments that supporters will have in a bar. And I don't think it was necessarily what a senior player in a team going for the title should be looking at in December. I can understand it a bit more in April and May when things are really tight. But I think Inter needs to just rise above all of this. And if Allegri wants to paint out the Juventus are only trying to get back in the top 4, and that is their sole target, and they're not going to even contemplate the fact that they could win the title, even though players like Rabiot and Szczesny and lots of players have come out and basically said, we want to win the title. they're falling into a trap a little bit, and I think they just need to rise above it and completely ignore what's going on elsewhere and say, we're just going to win our games, and we'll, much like Juventus do. We'll see where we are come March, April. If we're in the title race, then we'll start talking about it. And Inter will clearly be there. And I think they're getting too drawn in already to this 2-horse race, and we shouldn't be held up as the standout favourites for the title. It's like you can't have it both ways, if you ask me. If you're going to take all of the plaudits and the praise for reaching the Champions League final, and then you're going to every time admit when it's put to you in interviews that yes, you have then grown in self-confidence and belief as a team and as individuals since you made the Champions League final and went toe-to-toe with Manchester City, then I think you need to both accept that you're going to be title favourites, but also say, and we'll take everything that comes with that, criticism when we don't necessarily always get points, and also just try and block out the noise coming from elsewhere. And I think we're seeing a little bit of some of the old Inter coming back, where vedono fantasmi ovunque, seeing these sort of spectre of like these, the boogeyman everywhere, the bogeyman, whatever you want to call it. And I think there's a little bit of that that's coming in, but that's just my interpretation.
Okay, so who's going to win it?
Inter, but I think it will be a lot closer than people thought it would be in September. Yeah.
Nikki?
I still have Inter winning. I just want to flag up a little something which I think is gonna, in my opinion, only sort of amplify these conversations that you're talking about, Patrick, which is because Inter have a couple of very winnable games coming up. They play Verona, then they play Monza. Juventus, meanwhile, have also got a couple of very winnable games coming up. You would say they play Salernitana, they play Sassuolo. Okay, Sassuolo, on paper, they certainly can play some good football, but right now they're 16th in the table. After that, Inter go to the Supercoppa, which, as we know, is now a semi-final final situation. And that means that Juventus will play twice before Inter play again. So there's 4 Juventus games for the next 2 Inter games in the schedule, is what I'm saying. So there's a chance that Juventus can put can really ramp this pressure up and go top of the table later this month. So definitely going to be fun to keep an eye on. I do think we should switch our attention to the reigning champions. I'm very sorry earlier for misspeaking and tripping up over my tongue and saying the champions I was about to introduce Inter, and I meant the league leaders. Napoli, of course, the champions. I was a bit dismissive of their performances earlier as well. They are down in 8th. They did draw with Monza. Is it just an irredeemable mess at this point? Or I suppose the more pressing question... Okay.
I think we can move on.
Well,
yes is the answer.
All right. Yes.
I mean, enough said. Move on.
What would you be wanting to do? Do you think
it's
Nazzari can get replaced, or is this just now we have to swallow it and endure this horrible season? It's a long way from here to May, or does the season end in May or June this season? I can't remember. It's a long way from here to the summer.
May. We got the Euro. May. Yeah.
Of course. Absolutely. Yeah.
No, I think it is a write-off. I think it was a write-off as soon as they decided to dismiss Rudy Garcia. And you're looking at the wisdom of that decision now. It's a tricky one, isn't it? I think we can be sort of very revisionist and say the most logical. A bit like some people did, I'm not naming any names, but I had certain people come to me after Napoli won the Scudetto last season and said, "Oh no, well, I mean, they had the best goal scorer, they had the top scorer with Osimhen, Capocannoniere, they had the MVP with Kvaratskhelia, they had the defender of the year, Kim, they had Giuntoli and Spalletti and all this sort of stuff." And I said, no one was saying that when they sold Koulibaly and Insigne and Mertens and Ospina and so on and so forth. And I think there's a danger of this happening again. It's very easy for me to sit here on the 2nd of January and say, once you win the title after 33 years, you're very unlikely to win it again. You know that Giuntoli is dragging his heels over staying. You know that Spalletti is not getting on with De Laurentiis. You know that there's a release clause for Kim that either Manchester United or Bayern, whichever of the foreign suitors is going to activate. So at this stage, just decide to do another complete overhaul for the second time in 12 months and completely revise your targets. You couldn't do it because of the way that fan base are. Well, any fan base, I think, having won the league title, they want to see renewed ambition. They want to see you improve upon the squad that you've got, go out and spend money and actually improve the squad, not only try and win the Scudetto again, but go even further in the Champions League, having got to the quarterfinals. But I think at this stage, you almost think, if you're going to then appoint Rudy Garcia, who's 8th or 9th down on your shortlist, which then becomes a long list by extension, I think you're almost better off saying, we can't get the coach we want, so we are going to say our target is now just to qualify for Europe, and we're going to gamble on a young coach and give him time. And we're also going to preempt what is going to happen sooner or later. We're going to sell Zielinski so we don't lose him on a free to Inter in the summer and lose one of our senior players to a rival. We're going to sell Kvaratskhelia because he's got however many zeros 100 million euros is as a valuation. What's that, 9 figures? We're going to sell Victor Osimhen because he's just scored 26 goals and he's wanted in Saudi Arabia or, Chelsea, wherever it may be. And I think you could have almost repeated the trick. Maybe it wouldn't have worked out well because you still had a president who's a bit of a megalomaniac and who wants to make footballing decisions that he's not qualified for. But at least you would have made things very clear from the outset to the fan base and said, we've just won this, but we are going to take a long-term approach and we want to do this again. We won't do it necessarily next season, but we might do it 4 or 5 years from now. And we're going to reinvest the funds that we generate from these superstar players into trying to find the next set. And I think, but that would require Napoli seeing where they are in the Italian football food chain. And I think there have been delusions of grandeur. And I say that, it slightly pains me to say that, but this is a team that's won 3 Scudetti in their history. 2 of them came with Maradona. The third one came 33 years after the previous one. And it came about because you brought in Kvaratskhelia, who was completely unknown, who was only playing back in Georgia because of the war in Ukraine. You had Osimhen, who finally managed to stay fit long enough for him to score 26 goals. You had Spalletti, who finally managed to put all of the pieces together in that second season. And you had a once-in-a-generation type player in Kim Min-jae, who just came in and settled immediately and performed and allowed you to play a high line 30 or 40 yards from your own goal. And I think those are unique ingredients. So I know this is a very long-winded, convoluted answer, so I apologize. But I think in light of all of this, once you bring in Rudy Garcia, you either have to say we're with him until the end, and then we will give him the whole season. And if he finishes outside the Champions League places, we will dismiss him and then we'll act accordingly. Or you sack him in September because you've got Antonio Conte who agrees to take it. Conte says no in September. You make peace. The mistake is there. We're going to try and limit the damage. But limiting the damage is not bringing in Walter Mazzarri. And we've seen that for yet another example. And allowances were made for him because the first few games were Atalanta away, Real Madrid at home, Inter at home, and so on and so forth, Juventus away. And so, once he won that first game against Atalanta, that brought him a bit of credit. But when you are struggling to beat Monster at home, and by the way, Napoli created a lot of opportunities, but that doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. I hate people that cling to XG. That's what football's all about. If you don't take your chances, then it's just pointless. You can have 8 goal-scoring chances and not take a single one and draw 0-0. Someone else might score a completely fluky own goal and they win a match. And by the way, they only drew the game because Matteo Pessina decided to do a Jorginho and took a ridiculous stutter step penalty that Alex Meret not only saved, but he was able to gather it, didn't even need to parry it. So I think Mazzarri got sent off because his latest thing is that he feels that Osimhen and Kvaratskhelia are being kicked out of games. I'm sorry, that's what comes with being the champions. That's what comes with having last season's leading goal scorer and last season's most valuable player. Them's the breaks. You have to deal with it. You're up there to be shot at. People will not yet let you play. People know what to expect from you. And you have to come up with something different. And there is no alternative plan whatsoever. Napoli seem to have no idea what they're doing. It's Mazzarri's come in and tried to reproduce Spalletti light, having said, I watched them last season. This is how, trying to appease the president and the fan base who were completely disillusioned by the fact that Garcia came in and very quickly said, I didn't watch Napoli, I don't know what they're about, which in some ways, had he expressed it differently, had he said, that was a unique team with a unique player in Kim who's no longer here, we haven't replaced him, that was Spalletti's way of playing, I don't think I can emulate him playing this way, so I'm going to play a different way. Had he expressed himself differently, then I think he might have had a bit more success. Instead, he came across as quite arrogant and dismissive of one of the most successful seasons in the club's history. And And this is where we are. And then for De Laurentiis to then hold a press conference after the game and say it's all my fault, it's exhausting. There is nothing more exhausting than being a Napoli supporter.
It is his fault, let's be honest, because he didn't want to give Spalletti any credit for what he managed and what he built. He's in a season now where everyone knows. I mean, towards the end of the last season, everyone started to figure out what to do with Kvaratskhelia and Osimhen and try to minimize their effect and impact on the game as much as possible, including Lobotka, obviously. And I think that, you're Giuntoli went, Spalletti went, the two architects behind this team. And then he didn't even want to give the credit to Spalletti for what he created or to Giuntoli for finding Kvaratskhelia. He said it was his son all along that had known about Kvaratskhelia, and it was his son who had brought him in. And it's the usual stuff. It's us. We've built this. We've done this. Everyone else is just a worker and an employee that we scout and we bring in. But he's acknowledged that he has made these mistakes. And I understand that. I mean, Walter Mezzari's average per game is 1.16 point, which is terrible. When you look at Rudi Garcia, it's 1.75. It's actually worse than what Rudi Garcia managed. But obviously, it's fewer games, so take that as you will when with a pinch of salt. I do think that this is a team that's a little bit depressed, that's relying a lot on what Kvaratskhelia can do, which is very difficult when he is being tracked by two players all the time. So you're asking him to do a lot. I think it's very bizarre to bring in Simeone, who's your striker, on the 85th minute to try to do something. There doesn't seem to be a clear plan. And I think that one thing that Pep Guardiola always said is that when your team wins, this is the most important time to go to the transfer market. We saw that with Tottenham when they had reached the Champions League final and they started to do really well, and then they decided to, since we're doing so well, we're not going to go into the transfer market, and then it just fell apart and Pochettino was sacked. We saw that obviously with teams that have done so much. Even the great Manchester City, there's been times where they've done amazingly well and not been able, like when Liverpool won it, to keep up the same performances because they haven't dipped into the transfer market. It changes things. It allows different players to come in and makes it more unpredictable. Right now, we know exactly what Napoli want to do, except they're not even being trained by Spalletti, who can find different ways to go about it. I think it's also important to note that Monza are pretty crap, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't know whether it's just me, but I think they've been awful, honestly, for so long now. They can't find a goal to save their lives at the moment. Pessina is somebody I'm a really big fan of, but I don't know what that penalty was about. But people make mistakes on penalties, so it happens. Also, it's a defense that had so many absences. There was no Pablo Mari. There was no...
suspended, yeah.
Yeah, so just lots of absences, the players that are not there. And when you see that there's an opportunity for you to attack that defense that's weakened, do something about it. But they didn't. And so I don't know where Napoli's going to end up. I don't know what it is, but I think it's time Lautaro Di Laurentiis, since he knows so much about football, maybe he can fix it. Let's see.
Wow, Mina giving it both barrels, and I think she's right, to be fair, but I did enjoy that you made sure to get a little dig in at Monza as well. I knew that's going to be in your bonnet, Mina. So I suppose the question when I talk about situations being irredeemable or not, we immediately turn our minds, it's January, to the transfer window and what can be done. I think it's going to be a particularly interesting transfer window because of the news that everyone's been talking about in the last few days, which is the decision to allow the decreto crescita to lapse, which means that the growth decree in Italy, which does not just apply to football, by the way, this is a law that has applied to foreign professionals and has offered tax breaks to foreign professionals and also to Italians who've lived abroad returning to Italy. It was brought in several years ago, I think 2019, to effectively try to boost the Italian economy and to lift some things up. Within football, it has effectively meant that teams can save themselves about 50% of the tax that they would normally be spending on a player's wages. So it has had an impact on the transfer market. We've been talking about this, and we think we're going to do a little deeper dive into that and its impact on teams as a one-off for our Patreon listeners. In fact, excited to say we've been talking about this as we get into the new year, and now we have Patrick on board. We would like to start doing some more specials for you guys on Patreon, so watch this space on that front. But we'll be back to have a deeper convo about that certainly in the next little bit. But for now, I'll just say, if football teams were looking for, I suppose, the upside in this situation, because certainly there are several teams. In fact, you heard several team directors come out in the last few days and say this change in the law will affect our transfer plans. I should stress it's not being applied retrospectively, so it's only for going forward. But clubs like Milan, Inter have already said, yes, this is going to change how we do business this January, not getting those tax breaks. But if you're looking for, I suppose, the optimistic side of it, there was a wonderful story came out in Fiorentina with their winning their game, winning 1-0 against Torino with a goal from Luca Ranieri. And the reason that this felt so analogous to me is that Luca Ranieri is a product of the Fiorentina youth system, who was more or less on his way out of the club. It seemed like he'd been there for 5 years, I think, as a youth player, and then he went on and was sent on loan for his first four full seasons as a senior player. Last season, they kept him around, didn't send him on loan, specifically because of UEFA's homegrown player rule. They found themselves in a situation where they were going into the Europa Conference League. They had the option to have a 25-player list for the Conference League, and Ranieri fit the bill, and they didn't have other players who fit the bill, and here's another body, and it's better to have the body than to not. Ranieri played, I think it was, I couldn't tell you how he played. He started 6 games in the Conference League, almost all of them in the knockout round. He went from being this peripheral figure to being someone who worked his way into the first team, started games at the end of last season for them, and now has become a starter in their Serie A team as well. He started games regularly for them this season. He scored 4 goals in all competitions, including this winner against Torino. He's sort of this, at 24 years old, this embodiment of, well, actually, what if instead of buying foreigners for everything, we look to our youth systems and maybe put some extra energy into these players? We might find some rewards. But Fiorentina are also a great story in their own right, because they are 4th in the table right now. And frankly, I don't know if I can give you good reasons how they're doing it beyond Vincenzo Italiano, because the squad was already, I would say, performing at its level in the last couple of seasons to finish 7th and 8th, to go to the Conference League final. It was pushing itself very hard. Did go to Coppa Italia final last season as well. Then you take out Sofyan Amrabat in the summer, and this season, they said goodbye to Jovic, they said goodbye to Cabral as well, which perhaps those aren't big losses because the attack wasn't really working, but they go out and sign Lucas Beltran, bring in Nzola. Those two also not scoring goals for them, so they still haven't found a solution up front to the selling of Dusan Vlahovic 2 years ago. And yet, here they are 4th in the table, defying gravity, with their top scorer, Nico Gonzalez, injured and still winning 3 games without him. They are an extraordinary story. Not always extraordinary football. If anything, I would say the football has been less and less extraordinary in recent weeks for what Italiano would like. But results are results, and they're getting them right now. I don't know if you guys have enjoyed watching that as much as I have, just seeing Italiano find ways to keep that team winning.
I like the rise of Luca Ranieri. I think you make a very good point there, sort of the poster boy for what a player can achieve if a club is patient with them. And we know that Italian clubs can often send players out on what seems like an interminable number of loans. I mean, I don't think Roberto Piccoli will ever play regularly for Atalanta, but I think he's on his 6th different loan spell away from Atalanta. He actually missed a chance for them against them for Lecce the other day. But Luca Ranieri, if memory serves, was part of the 2019 Italy U20 squad. He's from the 99 generation, which is a really good generation. Scamacca, Fratesi, Bastoni, albeit he wasn't in that squad because he was already very established by then. Donnarumma's a 99, obviously he wasn't in that squad, but Carnesecchi, who's a 2000, played in that team. Luca Ranieri was in it, Luca Pellegrini as well, so much so that Luca Pellegrini was being played as a number 8. His career hasn't really developed at all. But I like what I've seen from Luca Ranieri, and he's also shown how versatile he can be as well, because he was initially a left wing back. We've seen him play as a left centre back as part of a 3. We've seen him play as a left centre back as part of a 4. And clearly has an eye for goal, as you said. And I think what Fiorentina are doing this season is very different to what we've seen previously for them under Italiano, namely where they were a bit gung ho and they would score goals, but for every time they would, I still, for me, the sort of the Fiorentina under Italiano game par excellence was when they lost 4-3 at the Franchi to Inter, and Mkhitaryan scored in like the 95th minute. And, they were 3-3 against Inter, and they were still chasing a winner, and they ended up getting caught. It was about 4-on-1 on the counter attack, and Mkhitaryan scored. And I think they've become a lot cuter now. I think their progress in Europe has helped them in terms of coming up against different types of opposition. And it's Italian football. If you can defend well and keep clean sheets, I mean, this is true of any league, but we mentioned it off air before on the pod. I mean, Terracciano seems to now actually be producing consistently, which wasn't always the case, and they're not conceding goals. I think one in December, all told. I think Mini said it was 4 clean sheets in 5, and that's a huge platform upon which to build, especially as you said, Nico Gonzalez is your top scorer. He plays on right wing as part of a 4-3-3, and you haven't really been able to replace Vlahovic. It didn't work out with Artur Cabral, who's now gone on to Benfica. It didn't work out with Luka Jovic, and it hasn't really worked out so far with Beltrano and Zola. So you have to find a way to win, and if your strikers aren't scoring and your top scorer is injured, the best way to win is by not conceding and then trying to nick a goal, which is exactly what they did. You've got a defender forward who scores, I think it was the 85th minute, wasn't it, when they got the winner? And that's a huge difference between 1 point and 3.
I think also it's. I mean, I'm very impressed with Fiorentina and actually trying to see how they can switch themselves, move to a 3-man back line if it means securing the result. But I think it's also like, I was really impressed. So I started looking at their record. And if we look at the last, the clean sheets, they've been against Torino, Monza, Verona, Salernitana. And the goal in the game in which they did concede, because it's 4 out of 5, was Roma. So I do think that it's they're very terrible teams to go up against, who probably also have the same problems that you do. So I don't know how much to read into that, because, when they have come up, obviously they had a dreadful performance against Empoli, who beat them 2-0, lost to Lazio 1-0, did they lose to Bologna? No, they didn't. They lost to Milan. So I think that I don't know. I think there's still a lot that I would still need to see about Fiorentina at the moment in time. I'm not sure how far that they are going to go. I think that they're good at beating the teams that they should beat. It's about the other teams that I'm interested to see where they get to, because it is a problem that they don't have a forward. I think it's a huge problem for them, and I think they're finding solutions to at least keep the back door closed, which is something that's been a problem for them. But I would need to see how they develop, because I'm not yet convinced that this is. I think there's always going to be progress against when it comes to Italiano teams, because last year at this point they had, I think, 23 points, and now they're on 33. But I have to see.
Yeah, I certainly don't personally think they're going to finish in the top 4 this season. Obviously, there's so much unknown. We're going into the January transfer window. Also, haven't mentioned yet, we're about to have the Africa Cup of Nations, and Fiorentina, like many teams, are going to lose players the Africa Cup of Nations. So a slightly interesting situation there, actually, because I think it's Nzola actually is saying he doesn't necessarily want to go to the Africa Cup of Nations and is trying to resist his call-up to go and play for Angola, perhaps because he's trying to establish himself more successfully at Fiorentina, and yet to be determined how that gets resolved, because you're supposed to respond to international call-ups under the agreements the clubs have with FIFA. They don't want clubs interfering with that dynamic, and that's where the will of the player will come into things. But I think just worth flagging up how well they're doing right now. I do share your concerns for them, Mina. I think the squad is ultimately quite limited. And look, even Ranieri, I'm hugely enthusiastic about what he's doing. I've seen people saying, he needs to get into the Italy team. And I was thinking, well, centre-back is not actually a position where I'm too worried about Italy just yet. I think he's still got plenty of football he needs to play and get into his legs. And the counterpoint of what Patrick was saying about him being a very versatile player, which he is, I'm not certain he's a well-rounded centre-back yet. I think he's got a really interesting willingness to jump on passes and to step out, but he hasn't got that physical strength. And how much is that going to affect him playing in different types of backlines? I don't know. I'm not trying to drag him down, having just built him up. I'm just saying that we can praise things without saying not everything is immediately at the level of perfection, which I think is a fair way to reflect on Fiorentina at the moment. But whichever way you cut it, 4th in the table is hugely impressive by Vincenzo Italiano with the resources he's got there. Not a particularly thrilling round elsewhere. Udinese did put 3 past Bologna. Other than that, we had a total of 14 goals across this New Year round. So I don't know if there's any other games you guys particularly want to get into. I don't have anything burning on my list, but if there's anything else you wanted to say, this is the moment. No, it doesn't look like they do. So just to remind everyone, we've got Coppa Italia round of 16 this week, Milan Cagliari on Tuesday night, Roma Cremonese on Wednesday night. And Mina or Patrick, who wants to take us through our new Chronicles Tifosi shout-outs? Because I've done a lot of talking, so I'll let someone else come in and do our shout-outs for our new Chronicles Tifosi before we sign off.
So a shout-out to all of our new Chronicles Tifosi. We've got Costa, Tom Downs, MAR, Matthew Gordon, and a big welcome back as well to Mike Guerrieri. So welcome back to Mike, and shout out to all of those new faces as well. Great to see those new Tifosi on board.
Thank you for that. Okay, guys, well, Happy New Year. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back next week, as always, recording on a Tuesday. Just a reminder to Chronicles Tifosi Patreons to join the Chronicles Tifosi chat in the Patreon app. Find us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. All links are in the show notes. And join us for another podcast next week. And we're looking to bring in new parts to the show. So if you have any suggestions or any ideas, then please do write to us as to what you would like to see us talk about, what you would like more from the podcast. We leave it in your hands. And hopefully you can come up with some suggestions for us as to how we can make this an even better podcast. Thank you to Patrick. Thank you to producer Simon. And of course to Nikki Bandini, our show host.
Serie A Chronicles is a Serie A Chronicles production.